Okay, hey, it's Jordan and Vince back on Not a Tame Sheep. And tonight we're going to talk about a book, The Hexagon of Heresy, a historical and theological study of definitional divine simplicity. It's written by James D. Gifford Jr. Um, this book was recommended to me, and I bought it. And so I posted about it in our church split apologetics group. And I was kind of surprised the response. So many people have read it and said it was awesome, and several people asked me to give my thoughts as I went. So that's kind of what we're going to do tonight. We're just going to go through it. I'm going to give a few thoughts. So far, what am I? 50 pages? Yeah, somewhere 53. I think I read through chapter 3, so but this does seem to be the meat of the argument. And then I did listen to James Gifford. He was interviewed by Leighton Flowers, so I listened to that talk too, so I could get a little bit of a feel for what he was saying. So,
Yeah, full
so
disclosure, I did try to. I know, Jordan, you sent me the book and we were going to talk about it together, and I read it. So if you read it and you have no idea what it's saying, same. I read it and I messaged you, Jordan. I said, I don't know what's going on, and I don't know what half the words mean. So I was going to
yeah,
have more talking today, but I'm not intelligent enough to understand what's going on.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think I understand his argument. I just listened to his episode with Leighton so I could,
Hmm.
have a better feel, to make sure I wasn't, I don't want to misrepresent anybody, and I want to be generous. I so far I think the book is worth reading. So, it's not like I want to sit here and tell you it's a bunch of, you know, heresy and and bad.
Hmm.
I'm kind of enjoying it. So, um, but so let's start at page 3. You have it on Kindle, don't? Or do
I
you
do.
have the actual?
I do. I have it on Kindle. I'm cheap.
Oh, yeah. Well, I bought the physical copy because
Page
books like
three
this I
of the
need to take
introduction.
notes. Yeah, no, just go to page 3, I
Okay.
think. I'll talk about the introduction while you're doing it.
Okay.
So in the introduction, he talks about. So this, I thought this was interesting. Page 1, he says he's talking about quote, I want to trace out the way that most evangelical Protestants do systematic theology, unquote. you know,
Hmm.
And then he says, quote, most follow the Thomistic pattern of studying the attributes of the one God before moving to the examination of the Trinity, unquote. And I mean, if you understand Protestant, theology, it is not Thomistic. I mean, maybe they follow the Thomistic pattern and how they write their theology books, but
So
it's Augustinian. It's not Thomistic.
now
You
understand, is the complaint that because we start with the one God, we ignore the Trinity or Christ himself?
Well, his what he says is, let me just quote him. I would submit the thing hidden in plain sight that such an approach for constructing Christian doctrine is, well, not explicitly Christian. That is, Jesus is not the beginning, middle, and end of it all within that structure.
Hmm.
That's what he says. So, and I don't have any complaint with trying to be Christ centered. Um, I don't, I don't have a problem with that. I think, the order of systematic
I have
theology
not.
doesn't start with Christ because it's trying to move from what is known by observation. It's almost, well, and I don't want to say he's a presupper, but it's almost like presuppositional apologetics. If you don't just presuppose that Jesus was the Messiah, you know,
Hmm.
then, well, how do you know Jesus was the Messiah, right?
Yep.
So I think that's why, theology books, they don't start with Christ because you're moving, you're explaining how you're going to interpret things and why you believe the Bible is inspired. And then, you're going to give a theology of God. That's, I don't think that that's neglecting Christ. Especially if you believe Christ is God and, you believe in the Trinity, then starting there isn't wrong. He does say, the start of the, on page 3, he says, by the 3rd century, Christian thinkers felt more comfortable in explaining Christian reality, at least loosely, within the bounds of prevailing Greek metaphysics. And, Chesterton even says something very similar to that. When he's talking about Augustine, he says that Augustine reconciled Jerusalem to Athens. So, I mean, that sentiment, I think that's dead on. That's what Augustine did, is he looked at Greek philosophy and he read the scriptures, and his profession was he was a rhetorician, so he taught rhetoric and he taught Plato. So yeah, he reconciled Jerusalem to Athens. But like what I was saying about Thomas, is Chesterton continues and he says Thomas took the opposite approach. He reconciled Athens to Jerusalem. So instead of reconciling Christianity to Greek philosophy, he reconciled Greek philosophy to, I don't know, I just got mixed up, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. He was trying to he was changing Greek philosophy to match Christianity.
Yes,
find common ground.
That's what Aquinas was doing, right? So Augustine primarily used Plato, and Aquinas used both Plato and Aristotle, which is a point that Chesterton makes. So I think Chesterton is right, but I'm citing Chesterton, so because like I always say, I'm not a smart man, but I think everybody thinks Chesterton, at least had a clue what he was talking about. So, I'll make the logical fallacy of an appeal to authority there, or at least say, at least Chesterton is on the same page with me. So,
well, the appeal to authority is only a fallacy if it's an illegitimate authority, right?
Oh, yeah, or the authority is wrong, I guess. Right? Yeah. So, so on this first page, and this is something I've been meaning to talk about, he talks about Platonism's good and one as well as Aristotle's prime mover. And I think that there's a misunderstanding where, Greek philosophy, they say there's the unmoved mover. And you hear that sentence and you think that, the mover is God and it's the unmoved mover, so the mover is never moved. Does that make sense? But that's not what it's saying. It's reversed. This is what Aquinas explains with God being pure actuality, because, what is Aristotle? I think it's Aristotle says, anything that is put into motion is moved by another. So what the unmoved mover is saying is that God was never put into motion by something else. That's what it means by the unmoved mover. It's the thing that was always moving. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So God was always in act. God was always, if you believe the eternity is eternal, or whatever, or God and spirit at least, that God was always love. God is love, then God was love before he created anything. So God was always in the act of love. God was always in the act of being omnipotent. God was always in the act of being wise. So, that's why you start with his essential attributes. What are the attributes of God prior to creation? Because that's the start. Right? So when they say the unmoved mover, what they're saying is that there has to be something that wasn't put into motion by something else.
That makes sense, yeah.
Okay? Instead of saying that God is the mover and nobody can move him. You know, does
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
make
it means
sense?
nobody put him into motion because he was already in motion.
Right. And I think that people turn that around, and that's, you know, like this doctrine of impassibility, that God cannot be moved by anything, by, you know, and I think that that's a disconnect. Um, so it's just something that I find interesting to point out, that at least for Aquinas, he's saying that God is the mover, and everything that begins to move is moved by another. Nothing moved God because God was already moving.
Mm.
So, all right. So then, yeah. So what I have underlined here is he talks about encounters with God in the Old Testament and or with Jesus in the New are not encounters with an essence, but with a person. And um, I I think what's weird is that, you know, on page 46, where he's talking about Athanasius, I mean, the paragraph begins, quote, the sheer brilliance of Athanasius, you know, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And in that same paragraph, he says, you know, quote, meaningfully show whether it spoke of being or essence or action or energy, unquote. Well, if you're going to say it's wrong, you know, to say that there's an encounter with an essence, then how is Athanasius right, you know, 40 pages later?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I just read that and I thought, well, that's, I don't know what you call that. You call that a red herring or a mischaracterization? Because, you know, at least as far as for Aquinas, he's not saying that God is an essence and not a person.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying that God is one essence, which, you know, I mean, I could grab Geisler, then, you know, that's how he describes the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity, is that God is, uh, was it three persons in one being, and that being is one essence. So I don't know. I just thought that that was a little bit strange to say that it's not encounters with an essence, but with a person. But, you know, I don't. Augustine and Aquinas would both say that there's a Trinity, that it's three persons, the three
Mm-hmm.
persons of the Trinity. So,
It
but they're
seems
one essence.
it seems like he thinks that because they're not focusing on Christ right off the bat, that they're denying the personhood of God.
Right. They're saying they're beginning with, you know, like Aquinas. He starts with God's existence as God's essence is his existence. We talked
Mm-hmm.
about that before.
Yeah.
You know, and then so yeah, so you know, on the next page, if on the other hand we think of God as first, as an essence, we devalue the person. You know, I don't, you know, I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah, I
I
don't know.
mean,
When I read it,
if
I just thought, I don't understand why.
right, because God is one, and we're saying He is one essence revealed as three persons.
Yeah.
So I don't get the complaint. I guess. Do you see that too?
Yeah, no, I read it. That's actually why I messaged you that I didn't understand, because his argument seemed
Okay.
to be based on, I guess I would wonder how he defines the Trinity then as being one Godhead. Because if you focus only on the persons without the essence, I wonder how he like thinks that a Trinity exists. Does he think they're only one person?
Well, I don't know. Maybe he's saying you're supposed to think of them as three persons and then one essence. You know, again, I don't
Is it the
know.
order? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the problem, is the order. I don't know, because he does seem to believe that Athanasius was right to say that it's one essence. So, anyways, yeah. So in that same paragraph, he, quote, he is someone first and foremost, which is why any ordo theologiae which does not follow person moving to energy, thence to nature can run afoul of the biblical witness. And I mean, if that's wrong, what he's saying there is wrong, then yeah, then Aquinas was wrong, because Aquinas follows the same order that Paul gives in Romans, where Paul says, from the beginning, the divine attributes are, they're readily apparent
Mm-hmm.
in, in nature, in
Yeah.
creation. Well, that's what Paul says. From the beginning, God, there were no theophanies yet. God hadn't spoke to Abraham and Moses, and Christ hadn't come yet. So I don't know. And again, I'm not saying that, throw the book away because this doesn't make sense to me. I'm just saying that I don't understand how this is a fatal flaw. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And on page 5, he's talking about this, and he's so he's talking about Greek philosophers, in the philosophical process, and using negation of the observable cosmos. Well, that's true, because that's what Socrates did. So, and that's another thing that I really hesitated with about this book, is he talks about Plato and Plotinus, but he never talks about Parmenides. And Plato wrote Parmenides, and Socrates, his negation was a reaction to what Parmenides wrote.
Mm-hmm.
So, Parmenides, there's only being and non-being. So if something has being, that's where the one comes from. If everything that has being is part of the one. Mm-hmm. So they were all trying to make differentiation between the being, and the way Socrates did it was by negation. He said the wall is not the table, table's not the ceiling. And we use negation all of the time. A lot of people write that way. I'm not saying that I'm going to, give you $5. That's negation. But Aquinas didn't use negation; he used remotion. So, if you're gonna compare Socrates and Thomism, they're not the same, because yes, Socrates used negation, but Thomas used remotion, which is removal. So the way you find the attributes of God is you say, is God finite? And if you say, well, no, God isn't finite, then you have removed finite from God, which makes God infinite.
Mm.
And do you say God is impotent?
Yep.
Does God, and you say, well, no, God's not impotent, he's omnipotent. And then you say, is God imperfect? That's not negation. It's technically, it's remotion. You're removing any imperfection from God. So if you remove the imperfection of being imperfect, the only thing you're left with is perfect. So God is perfect. I mean, that's what Jesus says. God is perfect. Be perfect as God is perfect, or however that verse goes. So it's remotion, which is very similar to negation. I could see how someone could mistake it, but here he is talking about Greek philosophy. So I'm not saying he's wrong in what he wrote there. I'm just pointing out that there is a difference.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
Yep.
So the other thing I have underlined is he's talking about Plato and Plotinus, that the good or the one is uniquely good and utterly simple without any possibility of composition or decomposition. Well, if you're going to say that that's wrong, if God is good, he's omnibenevolent. Um, there isn't any lack of good in God. God is completely good. And you're going to say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. I mean, that seems to affirm both that God is the good and the one. Then you say that, there's no possibility of composition. Well, if you're going to say that that's wrong, that there is a possibility of composition, then who composes God? That's, that seems to be the problem here. Composition is done, by a composer, who 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 puts it together. And decomposition, God decomposes. I just, I don't know. I read that and I underlined it, and I'm like, well, if you're saying that's wrong, are you saying that someone else composed God? Who composed God? Who put him together? And who took these parts and put them together? And if God can decompose, what does that even mean? I don't know. I just underlined it. Okay, so so page 5, he says he's writing about Plato's and Plotinus, the one again. So, quote, it can have no distinct, discernible properties or predications, because that would indicate some form of differentiation, which is impossible by definition, unquote. So, I mean, I don't think that that's really wrong as far as Greek philosophy goes. But again, in Thomism, you're using remotion to find the attributes, and predication is done by analogy. So if this is a problem with Greek philosophy, it isn't at least a problem for Thomism. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is the problem is he just saying that Greek philosophy is Thomism then?
Well, no, I'm just saying that he talks about Thomism, and then he's going to, if I remember right, it's been a couple weeks since I read this. But anyways, I'm just talking about what I had underlined.
I gotcha.
People ask me, share my thoughts, so I'm sharing my thoughts.
Sounds good.
So I guess, and then this sentence about the differentiation, that was the problem they were trying to solve, which is monism. And that's what Parmenides taught. There's only being and non-being. Mono is one, one-ism, monism. That if there's only being and non-being, and there's no way to differentiate amongst the beings, then if there is a God, everything that has being is God. And that's pantheism. And pantheism has survived, longer than Christianity. It's been around a long time. Pantheism has. And then the other one is atheism. That's what atheism believes. Everything that has being, there is no God. So everything that has being is not God. And again, you're reduced to a monism, that because there's no way to differentiate between God, between being. If God's a being and I'm a being and we both have being, then everything's God. So if there is no God, then nothing that has being is God. So again, atheism is monism, pantheism is monism. And I'm probably not explaining it very well. Geisler has it in his systematic theology. It's laid out pretty simple, I thought. But so what Plato and Socrates are trying to do is, because they believed in the gods, They were trying to show how you can have gods, plural, you can have gods and have a, a universe that isn't God, you
Mm.
know? So
Yeah.
that's what Plato was trying, or what Socrates was doing with negation. So if the floor is not the table is not the wall, then he could do it by negation. People are not God. People are not the gods. The ocean isn't, the gods.
Mm.
It was, and then Plato did it by the forms. That's what, you know, realism is. The the watchers in the cave and then the forms going past.
Yep. I'm familiar with
So,
that story.
right. So he was trying to make differentiation between beings using movers and forms.
Mm.
Okay. So that's what Plato was trying to do. Socrates was trying to do mitigation. The way Aquinas did it was by making a differentiation between actuality and potentiality. So a tree has a potential to be chopped down and made into a piece of furniture. Okay, so it has the potential to be a piece of furniture. When it's chopped down, cut up, and made into the piece of furniture, it actualizes being a table. And then you can cut the table up, throw it in the fireplace to set it on fire, and and heat your house.
Mm-hmm.
So, so what Aquinas said was everything the everything that God created has potentiality because we change. So we have change is motion then, where you move from the potential to do something to the act of doing something. So I'm sitting down, but I have the potential to walk. If I get up and walk across the room, then I actualized walking. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's why Aquinas went to the unmoved mover, because God is God is love, and he's always in the act of love. He doesn't have the potential to love, because that would mean that he moved from not loving to loving.
Yeah.
He moved from not being perfect to being perfect. That's change. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
It does. Yeah. So he's pure actuality, right?
Right. That's what pure actuality means, is that he doesn't go from the the potential to be wise to actually being wise.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, and so God doesn't become more wise. He's already wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the problem with with learning. That, like, I don't know how to do math, and I go take a class, and then I can do math. But God always knew how to do trigonometry. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like somebody taught him. That's what's meant by he doesn't learn. Does that make
Yeah,
sense? He
that
doesn't
does.
learn
Yeah.
how to be more wise. He doesn't learn how to be more powerful. He already is all powerful. He's already all wise.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the distinction, that the way Aquinas solved Parmenides' um, philosophical conundrum with monism. It's how he defeated monism. And Augustine did it differently, you know. But this book was written after both Augustine and Aquinas. So I don't know. You have to kind of uh, take it in that it's after both,
Mm-hmm.
because he, as far as I can tell, he doesn't differentiate between Augustine and Aquinas, and maybe he did, and I'm just not remembering. But so page 7, um, the Platonic doctrine of definitional divine simplicity can be defined to be understanding the divine essence first and foremost as the absence of all specifics. Um, so, I mean, if there's no specifics, then that's not Thomism, because you know Thomas said God's essence is his existence. That's a specific. I don't know. Well, then he says, I contend that the model for the Christian doctrine of God that both Origen and Augustine introduced into the faith is a modification of the very model of definitional simplicity as discussed immediately above. Now, there, I'm going to be like, I agree with a lot of that. I'm not real sure about the origin stuff that he says. We'll get to that later. But what Augustine did, yes, that's very, very, very close here. So instead of God's essence being his existence, for Augustine, God's essence is a will. So Augustine conceived of God as a will. And first and foremost, the absence of all specifics. God is a will. Well, what kind of will? He's an incomprehensible will, is what Augustine said. So, yeah, I agree. There's no specifics. You can't know. That's what's incomprehensible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so page 9. Now he's talking about the purpose of this book. I'll quote, the larger cosmological implication is of definitional simplicity. The first principle of the deficient cosmological models that produced the Christological heresies were ignored in the Latin West, which has been under the sway of that same first principle without interruption since the days of Augustine. And that's just patently false, because Aquinas refuted Augustine and gave a completely different model. And on the bottom of page 9, quote, there was the monist model, unquote. So he knows what monism is. And yes, there was monism. Augustine used Plato to come up with voluntarism, that God is to be conceived of as a form of will, and this will is incomprehensible, and it's immutable. And God, read the Westminster Shorter Catechism, right? God from eternity past ordained whatsoever comes to pass. That's Augustine. That's what he says. That it's absurd to say that anything could take place contrary to God's will. So when God created the world, he created it in a specific way so that everything will happen exactly as it did. Yeah, that's Augustine, but that's not Aquinas.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my problem here is that this is wrong, not so much that it's wrong about Augustine. I mean, I would say he's not describing what Augustine taught very well, because Augustine used voluntarism, which he got from, like I just said.
Yeah.
That God is to be conceived of as a form of will, and what God wills is correct because he so willed it. Those are the two parts of voluntarism, and that's not in here. So, okay. All right, page 10, quote, to create this third way, this type of simplicity had to be rejected for a divine complexity that did not entail any form of composition. And again, I don't get that. If God is composed, who composed him? And if you're talking about Augustine here, which he appears to be talking about Augustine, God's will is not composed. In fact, think about it this way. In Romans 9, Paul says, before the twins had been born, before they had done anything, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So Augustine, you can read on the predestination of the saints. Augustine took this thought from Romans 9 and he said, God willed, because God is a will, he willed before he created who he would love and who he would hate for the entire stretch of time, I guess. I don't know what else to say, So if it was back before Jacob and Esau were born, or if it's today, God already loves one and hates another from the foundation of the world. You read that all the time, right? And when Calvinists talk about this, and if you're going to, if you think, what must God be like that before he created the world, he loved Jacob and he hated Esau? The will of God. I mean, think about, you have kids, right?
Yep.
Which one of your kids, when they popped out, you're like, I hate you?
None of them. On
you pick them
record.
up, oh, I hate you, oh, you suck, Well, what parent does that? But this is, so Augustine read Romans 9, he misunderstood it, and he thought that God was hating and, damning people before they were even created, before he even created them. And to do that, your will has to be without passion.
Mm-hmm.
So God dispassionately chose some, the Jacobs, and he chose the Esau's for all of eternity. And, some he chose to love and some he chose to hate. And there's no reason can be given why he loved Jacob and hated Esau. He's just a will. And why is it that way? Because God willed it. And so his will is without passion. It's impassible. There, God looks at, you look at your baby and you're moved with passion. God looks at all of the babies and has zero passion because he's deciding who to love and who to hate dispassionately. Because if he had passion, he'd love them all, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what a normal father would do. So God has to be dispassionate. He has to be impassible. He has to be without passion. So, the problem here is Augustine and Romans 9. The problem isn't divine simplicity. All right. Okay. Page 10, he says, this chapter concludes with a discussion of Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham and the devastating effects of nominalism upon the psyche of Europe. Though no cardinal teaching ever deviates from the game plan of definitional simplicity. Okay, that is like, part of that is absolutely true and spot on. And part of that is absolutely false because Aquinas departed from what he's calling definitional simplicity. Aquinas departed from Augustine's views. And, you don't have to believe me, read John Duns Scotus. Scotus chastised Aquinas for departing from Augustine. And, Scotus wrote against Aquinas and in favor of Augustine. And, so Scotus, Aquinas believed in what's called intellectualism. God is to be conceived of as, God is to be conceived of as attributes, and something is correct, therefore God wills it. So that's natural law. So, unless you're going to say Thomas Aquinas denied natural law, that's what he believed. And Scotus and Augustine both believed in voluntarism. God is a will, and God wills it, therefore it's correct, because they both believe that God wills evil. So if God wills evil, then you have to have whatever God wills is correct, because he so willed it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, William of Ockham and nominalism, well, the nominalism goes back to Augustine. So if you pick up a philosophy book, they're going to say that Augustine was a realist. And I'm like, yeah, that's where the voluntarism comes from. He uses the realism of Plato, the Watchers in the Cave, to develop his voluntarism. that God is to be conceived of as that God is to be conceived of as a form of will, right? You got the movers and the forms. But then the nominalism also comes from Augustine. And realism and nominalism are actually opposed to each other. But Augustine only used nominalism in one specific way. So hold on a second, I'll read it to you. Sorry.
No problem.
So Augustine believed that God willed the fall of Adam with his will of permission. So if you conceive of God as a form of will, he has a will of permission, he has a secret will, he has, his perfect will, his decreeing will, he has these different wills. So Augustine believed that God willed Adam to fall by his will of permission. And if God willed the fall and the fall was evil, then God willed evil. If God willed evil and what God wills is good, then evil is good. That's just logic. That's a logical syllogism. And the fourth law of logic is the law of rational inference, where the conclusion necessarily follows. If you say God wills evil, and that premise is true, and what God wills is good, God's omnibenevolent, right? Then the conclusion necessarily follows. Evil is good.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't believe evil was good, right?
Yep.
So he's got this problem that logically, if God willed evil and what God wills is good, then evil is good. So here's what he wrote. Accordingly, in the case of these contraries, which we call good and evil, the rule of the logicians that two contraries cannot be predicated at the same time of the same thing does not hold. So in other words, what he's saying is that the law of non-contradiction does not apply to God. That God can do what is logically contradictory. God can will evil and it be good. That's nominalism. It's in name only.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, when he says the devastating effects of nominalism upon the psyche of Europe, yeah, because that's what William of Ockham believed. That's what Luther taught. That's what Calvin taught. That was the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
It was a regression to Augustine, to nominalism and voluntarism and compatibilism, down the line. An equivocal predication of the attributes of God, because you can't know what the attributes are. So instead of analogical predication, it's equivocal predication. So let's just talk about this. Oh, I thought this was good. This is a footnote. Though Augustine was challenged throughout his career on multiple issues, he was able to either overcome the challenges or obfuscate the issues enough so that his ideas triumphed in time. And I was just like, that sentence alone made this book worth purchasing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what he did. He obfuscated. He used Greek rhetoric to obfuscate. We've talked about this a bunch of times about Augustine using the word merit.
Mm-hmm.
He used the word merit to mean both earn and worth. And then he accused Pelagius of saying that people had merit. And then he would shift the meaning between earned and worth to be able to condemn Pelagius as a heretic. He just used rhetoric, same words, shifting the definitions to make his case, and then you just didn't notice that he shifted the definitions. He obfuscated. Yeah. All right, let's read page 11. What's this about? Okay, so I think that this was what I agreed with. He says, in chapter 10, he's going to talk about theological determinists from the 14th century onwards give with one hand that creation has integrity in being not God, but take it back with the other in insisting that God ordains and renders certain all that occurs in creation through a single decree that is identical with God himself. Exactly. Yes, this is exactly correct. That's what Augustine and Calvin and Luther were doing. They're using this what this author is calling definitional divine simplicity. I just call it Augustinian divine simplicity because that's more accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Augustinian divine simplicity. God's a will. Everything happens as He wills it. It's either by His, by His will of permission or whatever. But yeah, everything happens necessarily. And I can grab Calvin and we can read it. Everything that happens necessarily. Let's see. We're almost done to the introduction. We'll get to there and then we'll quit. All right, page 12, he says, because the God-man is a profound mystery, we cannot say with precision exactly what the hypostatic union is. We can, however, confidently state what it is not. And I read that and I thought, that's exactly what Aquinas did with the attributes of God. He did, that's using remotion. So I found that a little ironic. And then he talks about monism again. I'm like, yep, it started with monism. And then I found this line curious. This is the end of the introduction, the last thing I underlined. He says, quote, I have no desire to argue the merits or lack thereof of definitional simplicity from a philosophical point of view, unquote. That just baffles me. This is all philosophy. And then you don't want to argue the merits or lack thereof? If you're saying that nominalism, the devastating effects of nominalism, that's philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And that philosophy started with Augustine. Why don't you want to talk about it? It's the lack of merit in his argument that shows that it's wrong. You're saying that God wills evil, and what God wills is good, therefore evil is good, but somehow evil isn't good.
So is he trying to like make a point of like, I don't want to talk about philosophy, I'm going to talk about theology instead?
I think maybe this is a throwback to the start of the book where he's saying we shouldn't start with philosophy, we should start with Christ.
Yeah, it might be.
I'm not really sure. That's the problem when you read something and you're not talking to the author. And again, I'm trying to be generous. I'm trying to understand. I read that and I thought that's curious that you're going to say that definitional divine simplicity of philosophy is what led to all of these heresies, but then you don't want to talk about it. Well, why? That just doesn't make any sense to me. If you can prove that it's wrong, you don't want to argue the merits
that it was wrong and then to show what the consequences are theologically.
Right. Show that it lacks merit. I have no desire to argue the merits or lack thereof. That's what we want to know. Does the philosophical point of view that Augustine used have merit, or doesn't it? Because if it doesn't, then you can show why it's wrong and weed out these heresies, which seems to be his goal. So again, I mean, obviously I'm underlining the things that stood out to me. And usually the things that stand out to me are the things that are wrong. Although, like I said, that one verse that one sentence at the bottom, I'm like, yes, and nominalism destroyed Europe. Yes. There's some great stuff here. You've heard me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm at so far. And I think that's enough for tonight. There's still chapter 2 and chapter 3.
All right.
Well, I'll try and read them again and then we'll talk again.
Yeah, now that you read it too, I'll try to read it again. And so next time when we come and talk about it, maybe now understanding the introduction will help me.
Yeah, maybe after this you can read it and then we can rehash a little bit before we move on.
Yeah, and if anyone else listening, if they want to pick up the book and ask questions or whatnot, feel free on YouTube to comment it, and we might be able to discuss some of the questions that you guys have.
Yeah, we'll post it in the group. It'll be 2 weeks probably before we talk again. So people comment, then we'll try and talk about that next time.
Sounds good. See you guys later.